Would you want to be born a prince? Most people probably would. But there was a place in history where being a prince meant entering a race to the death against your own brothers, or living out your life in a prison, never knowing when it would end. And then, there was a time when your fate wasn't a quick death by the executioner's sword, but a slow decay in a dark room, ending at just 10 years old, and before you met that end, they forced you to sign your own mother's death warrant. If you follow this channel, you'll not only boost your empathy, but you'll also learn the lessons from history we must never forget. First, let's go to the east. To the most powerful empire of its time, the Ottomans. To be born a Şehzade, or prince, here, meant being born into breathtaking splendor, and at the same time, into an ice-cold fear that ran through your veins. Because in the Ottoman Empire, there was no simple rule of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits the throne, like in Europe. There was an ancient tradition that said, the state is the common property of the dynasty. And this tradition meant that every time a sultan died, bloody civil wars would erupt between the brothers. Mehmed the Conqueror, to prevent this chaos, codified one of the most ruthless and pragmatic state laws in history. A single sentence in his law code sealed the fate of every prince who was born. For the good of the world's order, Nizam-i-Alam, it is permissible to kill one's brothers. Meaning, for the order of the world, it is appropriate to execute your brothers. This wasn't murder. It was state policy. It was the price to be paid for the survival of the empire, a price that was sometimes paid by a trap, and sometimes by sheer luck. This ruthless system worked through a mechanism called the Sancak system. The princes were sent to provinces in Anatolia as governors to gain experience. But this wasn't a school, it was an arena for life and death. There, you would build your own army, make political allies, and learn to govern. But at the same time, you were waiting for the day your father would draw his last breath. Because when that day came, the first one to reach the capital, Istanbul, took the throne. Being the first to hear of your father's death and being in a province close to the capital could be your greatest advantage in this deadly race. And do you know what the first order of the new sultan was? To send his executioners to his brother's provinces. This was a game with no consolation prize for losing, a game where second place was never mentioned. To understand the tragedy this system created, we only need to focus on one name among thousands, Şehzade Mustafa. The brightest, most talented, and most beloved son of Suleiman the Magnificent. The soldiers adored him. The Janissaries, especially, were ready to die for him. The people saw in him the next Mehmed the Conqueror, the next Selim the Grim. He was handsome, brave, and just. And this was his greatest flaw, he was too perfect. Because there was another power in the palace, his father's great love, his wedded wife, Hürrem Sultan. She desired for one of her own sons, Selim or Bayezid, to take the throne. Together with the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, they wove a web of intrigue that took years to complete. They dripped poison into the Sultan's ear, whispering, Mustafa will rebel, the soldiers love him more than you, he wants your throne. Fake letters, exaggerated reports. Over the years, the most powerful ruler in the world, who made the oceans tremble and stood at the gates of Vienna, became convinced that his favorite son was a traitor. And that moment came. The year 1553, during the campaign against Persia. Suleiman summoned his son Mustafa to his royal tent. Mustafa's friends and generals begged him, "Don't go, Your Highness, it's a trap." But Mustafa trusted in his love for his father and in his own innocence. Maybe he just didn't want to believe it. He entered the tent alone, unarmed. Imagine that moment. You are in your father's tent. The one place in the world you should be safest. But your father is nowhere to be seen. Instead, 7 new executioners greet you. In shock, you call out for your father, but he is watching silently from behind a screen as you are put to death. A silk cord is thrown around your neck. You draw your last breath in the shadow of the very man who gave you life. This was the tragedy of the system. Cold, methodical, and inescapable. It was the moment a father's identity as a statesman strangled his identity as a father. Over time, this brutality weighed heavily on the palace's conscience, and a more humane solution was found, the Kafes, or cage system. Now, the princes were no longer killed. Instead, they were imprisoned for life in a luxurious apartment in the palace known as the Samsurluk. Sounds better, right? But it wasn't. This wasn't the death of the body, but the slow death of the mind and soul. Imagine, for your entire life, you cannot leave a single room or a small courtyard. You have no contact with the outside world, with the state, with other people. All you know are palace rumors and the daily fear that the executioners might come knocking at your door. Think of Sultan Ibrahim. During the reign of his iron-fisted brother, Murad IV, he lived in that cage for 22 years. Every day, every moment, filled with the fear, will I die today? When his brother finally died, the statesman came to his door to make him sultan. He was so convinced it was a trap to kill him that he barricaded the door and refused to come out. To convince him, they had to bring his dead brother's corpse to the door. At the end of 22 years, a man whose mind was shattered was placed at the head of an empire, where he became known as Ibrahim the Mad. This was the fate of a prince in the Ottoman Empire. A choice between two hells. Either shine with your talents and die a quick death by your father's betrayal, like Şehzade Mustafa, or spend a lifetime in fear and slowly lose your mind, like Sultan Ibrahim. A cold, systematic, and inescapable nightmare. The Ottoman Empire was, without a doubt, the worst place to be born a prince. You're either in a fight to the death with your brothers, or you're waiting in a room for the day you'll die. At least you have a chance, right? But in history, there is a prince who was given no chance at all. His story ended in a much more heartbreaking way: Crown Prince Louis Charles. The year, 1793. The place, France. His fate wasn't written by a state law. His fate was shattered by the rage of a starving public. He was born in the most magnificent palace in Europe, Versailles, as the future Louis XVII. His father was the well-meaning but indecisive King Louis XVI. His mother was the Austrian Queen Marie Antoinette, whose lavishness had earned her the hatred of the people. He also had his older sister, Marie Therese, who would be the only one to survive the revolution. And before her, his older brother, Louis Joseph, who died of tuberculosis just as the revolution was beginning, leaving the burden of the crown prince on this little boy's shoulders. Louis Charles was the youngest prince of a loving, but doomed, family caught in the eye of a storm. When he opened his eyes to the world revolved around him, until that world was shaken to its very foundations by the revolution. First, thousands of angry women marched on Versailles for bread and forced the family to move to Paris, under the public's watchful eye. Then, the family was caught in Varennes while trying to flee the country. In the public's eyes, this was proof that the king and queen were traitors. And finally, in August 1792, they were imprisoned in the Temple Tower, a gloomy medieval fortress in the middle of Paris. The gilded halls had given way to damp stone walls. Yes, the worst time to be a prince had already begun. In January 1793, he lost his father to the guillotine. He was just 7 years old. He saw his father for the last time the night before the execution, when his father made him swear an oath to never hold the people in hatred. With his father's death, he was immediately proclaimed King Louis XVII by royalists in exile. This title made him an even more dangerous symbol in the eyes of the revolution, a living monument that had to be destroyed. A few months later, at the age of 8, he endured the greatest trauma of his life. In the middle of the night, Revolutionary Guards burst into their cell. Their purpose was to take him. His mother, Marie Antoinette, became a lioness. She cornered the boy in the bed and shielded him with her body for 2 hours, screaming, "You will have to kill me to take my son." But in the end, they forcibly pushed her aside and tore the screaming child from his mother's arms. His mother's screams that night were the last sound of his mother he would ever hear. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was that the revolution decided not to kill him, but to turn him into a weapon against his own family. The young prince was handed over to a man named Antoine Simon, an illiterate, crude, and cruel cobbler. His job was to re-educate the prince, to break his noble spirit and replace it with that of a citizen of the Republic. This education was torture for the boy's mind and body. He was taught to curse his family. He was forced to drink alcohol. He was forced to sing La Marseillaise, the anthem of his father's killers, instead of royalist songs. But the revolution's most disgusting, most monstrous moment came in October 1793, during the trial of his mother, Marie Antoinette. The revolutionaries forced this 8-year-old child to sign a false statement claiming his mother had sexually abused him, that she had committed incest with him. Let's pause and think about that for a moment. An Ottoman prince was killed by his family for the good of the state. Louis Charles was forced to become a tool to kill his family for the good of the state. He was made his own mother's executioner. This was a far more perverse, a far more demonic fate. After this horrific betrayal, the child was of no more use to the revolutionaries. Simon left his post, and Louis Charles was locked away in the darkest, filthiest room in the tower. The door was nailed shut from the outside. For nearly 6 months, he lived in absolute isolation. His food was passed through a slot in the door. The room was never cleaned. The boy was never washed. He was left alone in his own filth, with vermin and in total darkness. He forgot how to speak. He became unable to walk. His body was covered in sores and scabies. The prince born in that golden cradle, seen as the future of Europe, was abandoned to rot alive, an anonymous misery cared for by no one. On June 10, 1795, at the age of 10, he died. His cause of death wasn't an executioner's rope or sword, it was years of neglect, torture, starvation, and disease. So many innocent children in this world have been killed or subjected to various tortures. In their memory, and with the wish for a better future. Please, share your thoughts on these tragic fates in the comments below.